The file landed on Stalin's desk in 1948 and should have ended everything. It contained surveillance reports, intercepted communications, testimony from informants embedded at the highest levels of the Soviet government. It named a specific man. It described specific meetings. It outlined, with the documentary precision that the NKVD had perfected over 2 decades of filing evidence against people it intended to destroy, a pattern of behavior that in Stalin's Soviet Union carried exactly one possible consequence. Stalin read the file. He set it aside. He did not act on it. This was not mercy. Stalin did not practice mercy. It was not oversight. The man had read every significant intelligence report produced by his security apparatus for 20 years. He consumed information the way other men consumed food, constantly and with total attention, processing everything through the singular filter of personal survival. He set the file aside because the man it named was Georgy Malenkov, and Georgy Malenkov was, in Stalin's assessment, the one member of the inner circle too bureaucratically dependent, too institutionally cautious, too fundamentally without the predatory instinct necessary for genuine betrayal. Stalin was wrong. He would spend the last 5 years of his life wrong about the man sitting closest to him, managing his correspondence, controlling access to his schedule, shaping which information reached him, and in what form. The man who appeared to everyone, including Stalin himself, as the perfect gray administrator, loyal because he was incapable of disloyalty, useful because he was incapable of ambition, was quietly and methodically constructing the conditions for Stalin's political succession without Stalin's knowledge or consent. The most dangerous man in any dictatorship is never the one who challenges the dictator directly. Direct challenge is visible. Direct challenge can be arrested, tried, executed, erased. The most dangerous man is the one who appears to have no ambition at all. Georgy Malenkov understood this with a completeness that bordered on genius, and he spent 20 years making sure that nobody, including the most paranoid leader in human history, ever looked at him long enough to see it, to understand how Malenkov operated inside Stalin's inner circle, and why the man Stalin trusted most was simultaneously the man most actively preparing for a world without him. You have to understand what surviving Stalin actually required. It required a performance of total self-erasure. The men who died in Stalin's purges died for a variety of documented reasons. Some had genuine political disagreements. Some had made enemies who held more influence. Some were simply unlucky, caught in the expanding geometry of a paranoid investigation that needed new names to sustain its momentum. But the underlying pattern, visible across hundreds of cases, was consistent. The men who were destroyed were men who had become visible as independent entities. Men who had constituencies, reputations, ideas associated with their names. Men who existed, in the political imagination of those around them, as something more than extensions of Stalin's will. Distinctiveness was the death sentence. The secure position was invisibility. Malenkov had understood this before most of the men around him finished understanding it, and he had constructed his entire public persona accordingly. He cultivated no personal following. He advanced no distinctive policy positions. He gave speeches that were remarkable primarily for their comprehensive lack of anything memorable. He wore the same expression in every photograph: attentive, neutral, present. The expression of a man who has trained himself to reflect rather than project. He was, in the language of Soviet political culture, the perfect apparatus man. The system's consummate servant. The bureaucrat who existed only to execute the will of whoever stood above him. This was the performance. Underneath it, something considerably more deliberate was operating. Malenkov had been accumulating institutional power since the late 1930s with a patience so extraordinary it became, in retrospect, its own form of ambition. He controlled the Central Committee Secretariat, the administrative spine of the Communist Party, the organ through which personnel decisions flowed, appointments were managed, and the loyalty of regional party organizations was maintained. This was not a glamorous position. It did not come with the visible authority of commanding the secret police or leading a military front. It came with something more durable than glamour. It came with files, and it came with the power to decide, quietly, invisibly, and with complete institutional legitimacy, who rose and who did not. For years, Malenkov used this position to build a network so carefully constructed that it did not look like a network at all. Men he had promoted to regional party positions. Men he had saved from investigations by ensuring their files were managed correctly. Men who owed him their careers without understanding, precisely, how the debt had been incurred or to whom it was formally owed. He was a creditor who never presented the bill while it was accumulating, which meant the balance grew undisturbed for years. Stalin watched all of this and saw an administrator. He was watching the most sophisticated political operation in the Soviet Union and reading it as paperwork. The relationship between Stalin and Malenkov was built on a misunderstanding so fundamental that it structured everything. Stalin believed that Malenkov's usefulness was technical, that he was a man who understood bureaucratic process and could be trusted with administrative functions precisely because he lacked the political instinct to exploit them. Malenkov allowed this belief to flourish because it was the most effective protection available. A man Stalin considered too limited to be dangerous was a man Stalin would not purge. He survived the 1930s. He survived the 1940s. He watched men of considerably greater apparent talent and considerably greater visible ambition disappear into the basement of Lubyanka, while he remained at his desk, processing correspondence, managing appointments, building his invisible architecture one careful stone at a time. He was present at the Kuntsevo Daka on the night of March 1, 1953, when the guard Lozgachev pushed open Stalin's door and found the most powerful man in the world lying on the floor in a puddle of his own urine, conscious, but unable to speak, his eyes wide with animal panic. Malenkov was one of the 4 men summoned to the Daka in the middle of the night. He stood over Stalin's paralyzed body alongside Khrushchev, Bulganin, and Beria. The 4 of them looked at the man who had defined the boundaries of their existence for 30 years, and they did not call for medical help immediately. They waited. The waiting was not coordinated, precisely. There was no explicit agreement made in that room, but the silence that settled over the 4 men standing above Stalin's body was the silence of people who understood, without needing to discuss it, that the arithmetic of their situation had changed fundamentally in the past hour. When the doctors finally arrived, they were visibly terrified. The senior Kremlin physicians had just been arrested in the doctor's plot. Every medical professional who now approached Stalin understood that if he died under their care, they would almost certainly follow him into Lubyanka. They worked with the frantic, frightened energy of men whose competence was overshadowed by their fear. Stalin died on March 5. He drowned slowly in his own failing body over 4 days. The moment the death was confirmed, the performance Malenkov had maintained for 2 decades was no longer necessary. He moved with a speed that surprised everyone who had read him as a passive administrator. Within hours, he had positioned himself as the primary figure in the collective leadership that nominally replaced Stalin. He assumed the role of chairman of the Council of Ministers, the head of government, projecting for the first time in his career the visible authority he had spent 20 years carefully avoiding. The transition revealed something that almost no one in the Kremlin had previously perceived. Malenkov did not need to build his power base in the aftermath of Stalin's death. He had already built it. The network of obligations, the institutional loyalties, the carefully managed personnel decisions, all of it was already in place, assembled over years of invisible labor, ready to be activated the moment the man it had been assembled around was no longer present. The other members of the inner circle looked at Malenkov's initial positioning and saw, for the first time, a man they had not actually been looking at. Beria saw a rival. He immediately began maneuvering against Malenkov's consolidation, using the MVD files and the reform gambit to reframe himself as the indispensable figure in the new order. The competition between them was real but asymmetric. Beria had the secret police. Malenkov had the party apparatus. And in the Soviet system, the party apparatus ultimately had more threads running through more institutions than any single security organ could match. But Malenkov also had Khrushchev's problem, which was that both of them needed Beria eliminated before they could compete with each other properly. The coalition that formed against Beria in the spring and early summer of 1953 was not built on genuine alliance. It was built on the shared arithmetic of survival. 3 men who were each planning to eventually outmaneuver the others agreed, temporarily and with clear-eyed mutual distrust, to remove the one member of the group who represented an immediate existential threat to all of them. Malenkov's role in Beria's arrest was characterized by the same quality that had defined his entire career. He was present, he was essential, and he was almost entirely invisible in terms of the decisive action. It was Khrushchev who built the coalition. It was Zhukov who walked through the door with the loaded weapon. It was Batitsky who fired the shot. Malenkov sat at the head of the table and pressed the hidden buzzer that opened the doors, and then, having done that one decisive thing, returned to the posture of careful administrative neutrality that had kept him alive for 2 decades. The buzzer press was, in retrospect, the perfect metaphor for Malenkov's entire political method. He was always at the table. He always controlled the mechanism. He pressed it at the right moment. And when the moment was over, he looked like a man who had been sitting quietly while others acted. The years that followed revealed the ultimate limit of the performance. Khrushchev understood, with the political intelligence of a man who had survived Stalin by genuinely reading people rather than merely managing their perceptions, that Malenkov's administrative apparatus was a threat that needed to be dismantled before it could be activated against him. The competition between them unfolded over 2 years with the specific texture of Soviet internal politics, not dramatic confrontations but incremental repositioning, the quiet withdrawal of support from key figures, the careful management of which policy failures were attributed to whom and in what forums. Malenkov's agricultural failures, the Soviet food production crisis that he had nominal responsibility for, were surfaced and amplified. His association with Beria, however tactical it had been, was used to shade his reputation inside the party apparatus he had built. By 1955, Malenkov was removed as chairman of the Council of Ministers. He was not arrested. He was not shot. He was sent to manage a hydroelectric plant in Kazakhstan. He managed it with apparent competence. He made no dramatic statements. He filed no public protests. He survived his own political execution with the same quality of self-erasure that had allowed him to survive everything else. He lived until 1988. He was 96 years old. 35 years in political exile, outliving virtually everyone who had ever sat at Stalin's table, outliving the Soviet system that had formed him, outliving the Cold War that had structured every calculation of his adult life. He attended church in his final years, a remarkable fact for a man who had administered state atheism at its most aggressive and gave occasional quiet interviews in which he said almost nothing of substance. The performance, apparently, never fully ended. The philosophical truth that Malenkov's career forces into the open is one that every study of authoritarian power eventually arrives at, from a different direction, and always with the same uncomfortable conclusion. Dictators are not destroyed by their enemies. They are managed by their subordinates. Stalin spent 30 years refining his ability to identify and neutralize genuine threats, men with independent constituencies, visible ambitions, ideas that competed with his own. He built a system of surveillance and terror specifically calibrated to detect and destroy exactly those threats. And it worked. He destroyed every man who looked like a threat. The man he trusted most, the man he never looked at hard enough to see clearly, was the one quietly building the world that would exist after him. Not through betrayal in any dramatic sense, not through conspiracy or ideology or the kind of principled opposition that the system was designed to crush. Through patience, through institutional accumulation, through the specific intelligence of a man who understood that in a system designed to destroy the visible, the only sustainable ambition is the invisible kind. Stalin died believing Malenkov was his most reliable instrument. Malenkov walked out of the Kuntsevo dacha on March 5, 1953, and activated a political infrastructure that Stalin had watched being assembled for 20 years without ever understanding what he was watching. The man trusted most was not working against Stalin. He was simply building the future. He had the patience to wait for Stalin to stop being in it. And in the end, that patience was the most lethal thing in the room. If this kind of history is what brings you back, subscribe. It's free, it takes 5 seconds, and it's the only way to make sure you catch what's coming next. And leave a comment below. Did Malenkov have a genuine plan all along, or was he simply the last man standing? I read every single one.